Kunal, there was another thing which you mentioned about that, there are certain qualitative and quantitative ways of measuring the brand equity.
Right.
I would like you to expand on the quantitative ways. So is it by certain brand health studies, NPS scores? What are those KPI metrics which you look into as a marketing head? That what are certain KPIs which you track?
Yeah, I think first of all, the quantitative part, we must say that, it's a combination of what you as a company or as a brand do yourself directly, and what some of the other third party agencies and companies tend to do. So as an example, let's start with the external part. When an interbrand, a globally recognized agency, does its evaluation of brands and brand value, and then you look at it and you see that where is your brand featuring in it? If it's featuring in it, what is the valuation of your brand? Over there, your role is relatively limited in terms of the valuation itself, but your role has been there in terms of ensuring building the brand equity and therefore your brand featuring there and having a certain valuation. So brands like Coca-Cola, Apple, all of these brands tend to get featured in that list quite often in the top ranks. But obviously behind the scenes, the marketers have been working for years in driving the brand equity for something like that. Similarly, brand equity, and since we're talking about brand equity, the brand equity supplement or edition of the Economic Times itself annually comes up with a list of brands that are most trusted, brands that are most valued. Again, this is something that is being done by a third party, but you as a marketer are looking at that, trying to see that is your brand being featured there or not. And therefore, it gives you insights into where does your brand sit in that evaluation. And therefore, if there needs to be work to be done, you need to go back to the drawing board and sit with your team that if your brand is, let's say, on rank 8th or rank 10th or rank 3rd, whatever be the case, how are we going to move and shift the needle further so that it moves up the ranks the year after? So that's taking measurements from a third party, but then taking action out of that, using that as a KPI to drive your action. The other way to do that is, hiring research agencies. Brands and companies do that regularly, where you go and meet consumers or customers. You do it in a quantitative way, so you need a certain number of customers that you meet. You ask them certain questions in terms of the brand. You start with basic questions. Are they even aware of the brand? What is the perception of the brand? Certain open-ended questions that, how do you perceive the brand? There are questions like top of mind. So let's say if I were to ask them in terms of chocolate brands as an example, what is the first brand that comes to your mind? So that first brand is what is known as the top of mind. And therefore, quantitatively, you see that is your brand being featured in the top of mind? If yes, what percentage of consumers are saying that as top of mind? Then if top of mind is not there, you start asking, okay, spontaneously tell us what are the other brands that you consume. So then you start seeing it within the list of spontaneous brands, is your brand featuring there or not? And then there is, aided. So
aided and unaided. Yeah,
aided and unaided. So aided is where you obviously, give the name of the brand, and then you ask them, okay, do you also consume or consider this brand? And sometimes, yes, the consumers have not remembered at that moment, but they say, of course I consider it. That tells you that it is there, but it's still at the aided stage. So as a marketer, I'm going to take back a KPI saying that, okay, how do we move it from aided to, let's say, awareness or spontaneous awareness? And then, of course, the ultimate goal is that your brand should be top of mind when you're speaking about a certain category. So that's another way to do it. Market share is a great example of looking into brand equity. So agencies measure market share on a monthly basis. They do it at a geography level. They do it at a segment level. So how is your market share shifting across years, across seasons, across geographies? Market share is a great indicator of what is happening to your brand equity. So I would say that, and market share can be a combination of both, in market based on what your consumer is saying, but also your, especially in terms of FMCG, the share of retail shelf space. So that also starts becoming important. That is the retailer showing importance to your brand? Is the retailer placing order for your brand or not? And that again is an indirect way of getting to know that there is brand equity or not. Because if the retailer is not asking for your brand, it's a clear, evaluation of what the consumer is asking for at the store or not. So there are various ways, and it differs on category to category. It depends on market to market. But these are some broad ways, and which I've worked with, which I've used, which we continue to use to measure how is brand equity for our brands, for our companies. So that would be my way of addressing this.
Yeah,
Sure.
and
So,
if I may, sorry,
yeah, sorry.
I just wanted to make one more addition here. You would recall this in one of the previous organizations where we worked together. Net Promoter Score,
Score.
the score.
I was going to say that.
Oh, okay, wonderful. Yeah, so NPS scores were a great metric for us to be able to see. And it's a simple question that whether a customer is going to recommend the organization or the product or the service, to others or not. Basically, it starts off with the rating. So, how would the customer rate you on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being highest and 1 being lowest? Based on the customer's response, the other question would be that what is that one single most important reason that made them give that particular rating? And that question basically helps us go in the mind of the customer and see how he is perceiving a brand or service, or based on his experience, right? So that for us used to be a very critical component of measuring our brand and products and services success.
Thanks for bringing this one, Vikesh. I must say that, if you move and change hats, and if I talk about B2B, so especially DSM, obviously you can't measure brand equity on a daily basis, on a monthly basis, because you're in the B2B space. So it's not as easy as FMCG. So here for us, the Net Promoter Score is one of the KPIs that we track. And like you said, how is it shifting year to year? But also we get a bit deeper into what are the key components that are important for our customers when they're buying and they're doing transactions with us. So is sustainability an important thing? Is quality an important thing? Is supply chain an important thing? Which are the ones where the scores have either come down or the importance have come down? And as direction from there, we then start thinking that within our campaigns, do we need to start talking more about that? Do we need to start building thought leadership around this topic because the scores have come down? So yeah, Net Promoter Score is another very important way of driving brand equity, especially I would say in B2B space. In B2C, it's relatively not used that much because you have many other ways to measure brand equity.
So if I were to summarize quickly the different factors or the different ways in which qualitatively we can measure the brand equity, one is the brand valuation, where like Kunal said, it could be third party. Now, when they do the brand valuation, there could be again various factors. What is the consumer feeling about it? What does the brand stand for in terms of quality? What is the brand promise in terms of the revenue which it has been able to generate? Is it consistently? There might be 10 different parameters which these third-party agencies use in order to derive the value for a brand. And then there are certain factors or certain studies which we do as marketeers. It could be around brand health. Now, when I say brand health, it could be with questions like aided awareness, unaided awareness, then top of mind awareness, and then what is the imagery which you associate with the brand. And then I remember we used to have these studies with MasterCard. Ipsos used to be their agency. So there were I think 10,000 sample set was really huge. 10,000 people used to be sampled month on month. And these questionnaires used to be sent to them. There were 150 questions. And one of the questions which I can still remember is that you have 3 cards in your wallet. One is Visa, one is Amex, and one is MasterCard, which is a card which you will use first when you will, do such kind of purchase. And then there used to be spider charts which used to be made that where do you rate MasterCard high on what aspect. So this is another thing. And then the third thing which Vikesh spoke about was about Net Promoter Score. So all these are different metrics which are being followed to evaluate a brand equity, and there are different tools and methods which are being used, right? There could be an agency, there could be a research which is being done, it could be market research, and it could also be doing consumer panel studies. Then the other one is the retail distribution. So what is your numeric distribution? What is your shelf space? What is your value-weighted distribution? Ultimately using both of them to come at the market share which you command in that particular area. So out of all the shops which are selling those categories, that category in which you are there, what is the share of your particular brand in those shops? So value-weighted distribution is another one which you see. And then there is obviously that you do a shelf space assessment. You actually go and see physically whether my stock is there at all those shops or not. So these are the different, I just listed some of the things because the audience would want some practical aspect into it. So these are some of the ways in which we can measure whether the brand is going in the right direction or not. And like Kunal rightly said, that these are different pointers for us as marketeers to see whether we are inching towards that brand valuation or not, whether we are inching in the right direction or not. And wherever we are lacking based on the data which we get from these studies, that is where our communication could work on. That is where my sales team could work on. That is where my distribution team could work on. That is where I can plan my activation calendar. That is where I could focus on a certain geography.
Well summarized.
Yeah. So I think the next point which we can talk about.
Harpreet, sorry, if I may, just before you move on to the next point.
Sure.
Yeah, so I'm just wanting to link it back to the components of brand equity, which we spoke about earlier, the Acker's framework. And when you're measuring equity, you are actually measuring each of these components, as Kunal spoke about, the first being brand awareness, and you measure that to top of mind, aided, unaided, right? And then you perceived quality and brand associations, which you use the direct as well as indirect methods to get what the customers feel about you. And the last being brand loyalty, in which the net promoter score fits beautifully. Also in brands which are more retail brands, the recency, frequency, monetary value of purchase, number of repeat purchases is a metric which in many industries track. But more recently, the willingness to search and the willingness to wait is also another metric which companies look at from the brand loyalty angle. So just wanted to link that back to the framework. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. I think that was a beautiful addition. So willingness to purchase was another one which we used to track at MasterCard. And like you said, the willingness to wait, the willingness
or
search, and the willingness to recommend, which again goes back to what Vikesh was saying. So it's willingness to search, willingness to wait, willingness to purchase, willingness to buy, willingness to recommend. All these are different factors which measure whether a consumer is inclined towards you as a brand. What is the propensity that he will recommend you as a brand to his peer network? So I think we can, like Kunal was saying, that there is a difference in brand equity between B2B and B2C brands. So maybe Professor Rupal, can you explain a little bit more on that?
So I just, there is a difference, but there are certain fundamental factors which remain the same, right? You still have to get the right customer insight. You still have to deliver on your brand promise, and you still have to give a seamless customer experience. And even more importantly, in this space, the trust and credibility and believability become very, very critical, right? The difference, to my mind, and I'll have Kunal add more to it because he's working in the B2B space and has B2C experience. But if you look at the number and kind of stakeholders in a B2B space is wider. So at one end, of course, is the customer and the consumer. At the other end is your employee. So the brand, what it stands for and the promise it is making, and has to be for all stakeholders. And in certain cases, there could be a third set of stakeholders who are influencers or partners in delivering your brand promise to the customer. So what the brand stands for has to be consistently implemented across all stakeholders. The experience of the customer, the employee, and the stakeholders with whom you have partnered, you have to ensure that you are making that seamless and adding value to each one of them, aligned with what your brand stands for. And in the network and platform economy today, stakeholders, partners, influencers are becoming even more and more important. So if I were to again share my screen for a brief moment, this is something, I'm sorry, this is, I've gone back, I'm really sorry. Yeah, here. So if you look at building B2B brands, it's simply saying what your company is and your brand is. Sometimes a brand is representative of the entire organization if you are following a master brand strategy. Okay, what does it stand for? Who is it? Who defines it? And why do you do what you do? And the customer experience part and employee value proposition plus the other stakeholders put together is really where your B2B brand equity gets built. And I'll just say this much and I'll leave Kunal to expand on that.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on head that on the head that there are definitely some commonalities. One of the biggest commonalities is that at the end of the day, you are communicating to a human being on the other side. Doesn't matter whether you're B2C or B2B. You need to emotionally touch them. You need to give them the functional benefits. You need to tell them what your brand stands for. So those parts are a given, and those fundamentals do not change. I think where it differs is two parts. One is that the purchase cycle and the customer journey is much shorter in the B2B, B2C world. What I mean by that is that, I could run an ad, I could start a sale, and chances are that the consumer or the customer sees it in the store or has seen an ad and will go out there to the market and make the purchase. So the result and the outcome is instant, and the purchase cycle therefore is shorter. In the B2B world, the purchase cycle and the customer journey is quite long. By the time you interact, you have your first interaction, your brand starts building awareness, and by the time you close a sale, it can sometimes take weeks, months, even years. There are times when, if you speak to a potential prospect customer, yes, they've heard of DSM, yes, they know the brand, yes, they know the company. How are they doing a deal with us, a transaction with us? Maybe, maybe not. And the maybe not to become a yes can take years. And that's, first of all, the one big difference. The second big difference is the number of, your audience itself. The target audience is much wider when it comes to B2B. We say that we are influencing the entire value chain. Every stakeholder in the value chain has a role to play. And then when we are, let's say, doing a transaction with a company, there are many different stakeholders, right from a procurement manager to a sustainability manager to the C-suite of the company to the nutritionist who's one of our core customers. So we need to positively influence each and every stakeholder for the sale to happen. In the B2C world, it is just either one, which is the consumer, or sometimes two, which is the customer and the consumer. And this customer and consumer is an important piece, which I want to kind of highlight to your audience, because when people don't get it, they often confuse. Why do I say customer and consumer in the B2C world especially? I'll take two examples to make this point. One is baby food and the other is pet food. In both these instances, your consumer is either the baby or the dog or the pet or the cat, but that's not your customer. The customer, in the case of baby food, is the parent. It could be the mother, it could be the father. It becomes the role of the marketer to positively influence the customer through the advertising, communication, distribution, and so on and so forth. But there's no point doing that if your product, the baby food, doesn't, connect with the baby doesn't feel nice and enjoys eating it. Same goes with the pet food. So I think this is an important differentiation that marketers have to keep in mind. They often use customers and consumers very easily, but in certain industries, when you have customers and consumers being different, then you need to really think differently. Anyway, having said that, the B2B and B2C, the purchase cycle is, the length of the purchase cycle is different, and just the target audience itself is much more wider in the B2B world, and therefore it takes longer. Therefore, you have to build trust, you have to build credibility, you have to build thought leadership much more, because they're not willing to change, first of all, the companies that they do transaction with. I mean, if you're going out there and you're buying a cola, a chocolate, or a soap, you don't mind trying a new brand. What's the big deal? You'll say, let me try a new one. If you get an offer, if you see a new packaging, if you see something interesting, you will switch much more faster. In the B2B world, the switch doesn't happen because it is not so much the communication, but it is much more the personal relationship which drives transactions. So there's a lot of work that we do behind the scenes in building that relationship with our customers and prospect customers, which is not so much the case in the B2C. In fact, you don't even know all your consumers in the B2C. There are millions of them. But in the B2B world, we can tell you who the customers are. We are potentially speaking and interacting with each and every customer. So that's another difference. And yet, you still are measuring brand equity for both these industries. You still are driving and going after brand equity. So therefore, all the other things that I spoke about in terms of your marketing strategy, the key questions to ask, they pretty much remain the same. And you're still every year looking at your growth numbers, your sales, your market share. So those aspects pretty much remain the same across the two industries.
One point, if I may just add to what Kunal said, is when he was speaking of the customer and the consumer, and even in the B2B space, I think one thing which brand marketers need to keep in mind is that not only do you look at your immediate customer, customer, you have to understand the customer's business and the customer's end consumer, right?
Yes.
How best to add value to this customer. So just wanted to build on that point Kunal made.
And I was about to add that and Intel as an example, where Intel has very smartly and beautifully also started pitching its brand to end customers to build an indirect pressure on the B2B customers, right? So so the end user, when it goes and asks that whether there's an Intel inside or not, Intel has done its job, right? So yeah, so I think what you said makes perfect sense, that brand marketers will also need to see beyond their immediate customers in B2B space.
And Vikesh, that Intel example also ties back to the brand property element which Kunal and Harpreet were talking about earlier, because and when Kunal mentioned that the logo and the properties have to be legally protectable. So when Intel was naming the Pentium, the problem was that earlier chips were named on a series of numbers which were not protectable, and then they came out with a name which stood for a new generation, a technology, an ingredient, and the Intel Inside logo itself became a mark of recognition for people to know if the computer, because the customer is actually not buying the chip, nor is the customer seeing the chip. So that Intel Inside logo is a very visible mark of identification and creating a stickiness for the brand, making it the negotiating power with the computer manufacturers that much more stronger. And also associating Intel with the memory and the brain of the computer. So building a very powerful association which goes beyond just the functional processing power of the chip. So just wanted to build on what Vikas said earlier. Great example, Vikas, of Intel. Vikesh, sorry. I'm so sorry, Vikesh.
That's fine. And in fact, you see that happening now in the mobile space as well. So you see Snapdragon and MediaTek advertising their processors because consumers also are becoming more aware. So consumers are also comparing products in greater details. So it's just about how my phone looks or whether the camera is good or not, but it's also about which processor, what speed, they're going into greater details now.
Yeah, and one thing to add to this, and I mentioned the entire value chain in the B2B. So when we speak about the entire value chain, the consumer definitely is part of that value chain. So we do look at that, but it's not always that you need to just start building your brand's awareness in the consumer's mind. You could do that, but you can also just leverage the consumer trends and say that, for as an example, if the Gen Z consumer is asking for more purposeful brands and sustainability is becoming important, you take that trend and then you go back to your customer and start sharing those trends, saying that your end consumer is asking for that, we are providing that to you, and therefore you can start having those conversations where the transactions become relatively easier, because you are going and saying that I understand your consumer and therefore I'm giving you what your consumer wants, without me trying to build my brand awareness with the consumer. That's not always necessary. You could do that, but there are other ways to also influence the consumer and hence the customer, especially in the B2B space. So yeah, it's a good example.
Yeah, very, very true, Kunal. I think if we focus on helping our customers succeed, they're going to stay loyal, and they're going to keep coming back to you. So fantastic point. Yeah.
Sure, and I think in this one, the example which Kunal gave, it again goes back to what Professor Rupal was saying. It is again establishing that consumer connect. So the consumer, it's being in sync with the consumer. If the consumer is worried about sustainability, if it's worried about environment, then your communication, and without diluting your brand positioning or without diluting your brand message, you can tailor your communication accordingly so that you are in sync and you still remain relevant. That was another thing which Professor Rupal was talking about, being relevant. So while you are you are establishing that differentiating value proposition, you still retain that relevance by talking in terms of what the consumer wants to look at. And going back to the example of B2B and B2C, Vikesh, you would be able to relate to this when at LexisNexis, since it's into B2B space, the decision time is longer because there are so many stakeholders which are involved. You rightly said that customer and consumer are very different. So consumer of a product, which was LexisNexis Practical Guidance, it's a software which we built. It's a software solution which we built for law firms and tax firms. The consumer is very different. And the influencer and the decision maker, it could be a CFO, it could be a CEO, it could be the finance people who actually influence the decision, who actually take the decision. But the influencer is a technical guy. An influencer is a law expert who's actually going to consume the product. So it's very important to look at both the aspects if you want to remain relevant.
Yeah.
I think we have covered most of the points. The last bit, although we spoke about that in bits and pieces, is how does brand equity impact a brand valuation and a company valuation in the long run? If we can talk about that a little bit, and then I think we will be summarizing the discussion. So maybe Kunal, you can add on that.
So I touched upon the importance of brand valuation, and I think, like I said, the brand valuation is an important piece, not only in terms of brand equity, but at the end of the day, every company is there to drive sales, to grow year on year, to gain market share, and a brand valuation is a great metric to know how and where the company sits in that landscape, in the competitive set. What is it that the company really needs to do? I think important part of that is also the investor community. We didn't touch on that, but especially for public listed companies, the investor community. How is your share price performing? What is the investor community saying? How strongly is your company being looked at, invested into? What is happening there? That's another great indicator of the work that marketers do, but also the other functions do. If you can drive brand equity and push the brand valuation, ultimately you're actually pushing your company valuation, and as a result, you're driving your market cap further. You're driving your share price further. So that's another important community that often marketers look at. So yes, you have consumers, but you also have to think about the shareholders. You have to think about the investors, especially if you are a public listed company. And this is where company valuation starts becoming very important, because you start, looking at things beyond just your limited scope of one brand, because most companies have multiple brands, and therefore it's a combination of the work that various marketers are doing. I could build the brand equity for one brand in a company, which is fine. It will move the needle, it will push the company to some extent. But if all the brands in the company are not pushing, and I say that all these brands, when they come together, when they push the brand equity, when the brand valuation of all the different brands start moving up, that's when the company valuation starts moving up. And the difference between a single brand equity and brand valuation versus company valuation is exactly that. It's looking at a combination of your entire portfolio, all the different brands that you have. How is the brand equity moving for each of that? And therefore, what is it doing for the company in totality? That's an important piece. You look back at some of these companies, whether it's Nestle, Britannia, at least the ones that I've worked with, or some of the other ones. You can also list down a bunch of brands within that. So Nestle, we spoke about Kit Kat, but you think about it, there's Nescafe, there's Maggie, there's the infant baby formula, there is Lactogen. There's so many brands, and that each brand, although they play in different categories, they have to come together to push the brand equity, which will then move the company valuation. So that's how the difference would be single brand versus multiple brands in moving the company valuation forward. And also looking at it from an investor's lens, that what is it that they are keen on. The ESG metrics, or the environmental, social, and governance metrics, we didn't touch a lot on that, but the ESG scores, especially in globally listed companies, become so important. At least in DSM, we can say that for us, sustainability and all the scores and all our commitments on sustainability are so important. Now we can say that, oh, but that's not something to do with marketing. But on the other hand, if you do not, really improve on those metrics, if you do not convince your investor community that you are serious about your purpose, about sustainability, you cannot move the brand equity forward, because after a point in time, investors and then the customers will start saying that here is a brand and a company that's not serious. I'd rather move to some other brand. And that's when brand equity starts dropping and company valuation starts dropping. So that's another way to look at it.
Sure, I think that was an interesting point about ESG. Professor Rupal, would you like to elaborate on this, and would you like to conclude as to what Kunal spoke about?
Yeah, just pick up from where Kunal left off. And when you're talking about investor community, as he rightly pointed out, that's very important stakeholder we need to discuss. See, in academic theory, we like to differentiate between tracking brand equity and brand valuation. They're very related and linked concepts. But tracking brand equity is about tracking each element of the brand equity, which we have been discussing in this session. And brand valuation refers to the financial value of a brand, which you use to either, if in some cases companies reflect it on their balance sheet, and you use it to buying and selling of brands, right? And to a certain extent, it is either derived from the market value of the brand or influences the market value of the brand for publicly listed brands, right? So how is it linked? If you have a strong brand equity, right, what it does is it helps you to get higher return on your marketing investments because you already have a loyal base of customers, you already have strong network distribution channels, you already have strong relationships which you can leverage, right, which leads to shorter time to market or shorter time to reach the desired scale, which leads to better cash flow, lesser interest cost, and therefore impacts your financial metrics. So both top line and bottom line get impacted. Second way in which it is linked is to look at the brand strength and the resilience of the brand and how it can help you counter risks which are likely to come in the future. So when you are looking at brand valuation, you are looking at the potential of this brand to earn in the future. If I have a strong brand, I am less susceptible to competitive attacks. I will eventually, if I don't do anything, I will die, but it can give me time to react. Okay. Customers are a little more forgiving. Also, if my brand has a wider footprint, if my brand stands not just for one functional attribute, but represents something broader, I can have a more range of products offered under the same brand. The risk associated with my future potential earnings gets reduced. So the strength of the brand is directly related to risk, which is related to the discount factor of future potential earnings, and therefore impacts the financial value of the brand. And I'd like to disclose it at that.
Sure, I think that was very beautifully summarized. So brand equity is one, and then brand valuation is basically deriving the financial value. And there are so many factors which go on into building a brand valuation. We spoke about so many factors which go on in building brand equity. And finally, brand equity translating into brand valuation. And how does a strong brand valuation guard a company's future, guard the brand's future for some time? Like you said, that there is time to react, which if you have a very strong brand equity and a very strong brand valuation, I'll take an example of Maggie. So that whole fiasco which happened around the component of lead in it, because the brand equity and was so strong, the brand was able to come back again to its previous glory. And although that there was some discomfort in between, but because of the strong brand connect, because of the strong brand equity, it was able to bounce back. And I think with this, we should be able to conclude this entire discussion about brand equity. Vikesh, you have anything to add or any other question which I have missed on?
No, not really. I think we've covered quite a lot today and in a very interesting manner, Preet. So thank you so much to Professor Rupal and Kunal, for perfectly connecting the theoretical concepts with practical industry examples. I'm sure this is going to be one of the very popular episodes when we roll it out. My only one bit, in the whole brand equity to brand valuation piece also would be that I think leaders also need to play a significant role here. Because the leaders, the owners or the managers, they are also in some way a part of the brand itself, part of the brand promise itself, right? So it becomes very important, as to what are they communicating, how are they communicating, and they can play a significant role in elevating the overall brand value proposition. A brilliant example of this is Mr. Narayan Murthy, single-handedly perhaps, uplifted a completely new organization, a new brand, with his brilliant storytelling, capabilities. So that's the only piece where I felt that perhaps it's also about people, the leaders who drive those brands to come forward and attach their personal credentials or their strengths to uplift the brand further.
Sure, I think, thanks. And like you said, I echo your sentiment. I enjoyed this conversation thoroughly. This is one of the best conversations we have had till now.
Yeah.
I mean, it was very beautifully synchronized, the switch over from academia to industry and back. And although I would like, and based on how we are placed and how both of the guests are placed, maybe we should have another session on brand valuation. First, let me just finish the recording. Let me just say a formal thank you, and then I will continue this conversation. So thank you so much for this wonderful conversation on brand equity. And thank you for taking time out.
Thank you for having us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much, Harpreet. Really enjoyed the conversation today. Thank you.
Sure, thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for watching part 2 of episode 4 on brand equity with Professor Rupal and Kunal. In this episode, or in this part, we looked at certain things like what are the certain KPIs which need to be tracked to measure brand equity or brand health. It could be NPS, it could be brand recall, it could be top of the mind brand recall, likes, shares, comment, retail shelf space, willingness to purchase, willingness to wait, willingness to recommend. What those KPI metrics are and how should they be tracked. So we looked at these KPI metrics and how should they be tracked. How can data from external agencies be leveraged for devising a brand building strategy? Now, when you get this data, then what needs to be done, or how do you make head and tail out of it? Some bit we touched on that. What is the difference in brand equity between B2b brand and B2C brand, if at all there is? Difference in customer and end consumer, and how to keep that in mind while building brand equity. So we looked at an example of Intel chip. How does brand equity impact a company valuation in the long run? And how brand equity can translate to higher brand and company valuation. So we looked at these aspects, and in the previous part of the same episode, we had looked at what is brand equity and different aspects of brand equity. In case you like the content, then please like, do, and share, and stay tuned at Marketing Demystified to get more such interesting episodes and more such interesting discussions on all nuances of marketing by both academia and industry. Thank you.